Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Bilingualism and Multilingualism. I am Dr. Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Sciences at IIT Kanpur. In this week, or in the last lecture of this week as I might say, I will be talking to you about bilingualism and multilingualism and a very important aspect, that is emotional expression. Now, so far we have seen how bilingualism might affect various aspects of our cognitive functioning, such as its relationship with thought processes, intelligence, memory, cognitive control, and so on. However, if you see, language is actually a vehicle through which emotions are expressed, and given that bilinguals have often more than one language at their disposal, they have that much more opportunity to label and express emotions. It presents an interesting opportunity through bilingualism to study the dynamic interaction between emotions and language. And this is precisely what I am planning to do in this current lecture. Now, researchers have actually shown that the emotions are actually influenced by the cultural and social context in which they are experienced. Cultural context can actually serve to organize and structure our emotional experiences. For example, if you look around, there are certain ways in which emotions are understood and expressed in various cultures. For example, in the eastern part of the world, for example, in countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, or Japan, there is a certain way of expressing our emotions. People typically think of emotions in a more important way. They give their own emotions a lot of importance. They think of emotions in a collective way. They also are not very shy of expressing themselves in a sense that they are basically you could say very comfortable in expressing their emotions. It is not considered, for example, a mark of their weakness if somebody is emotional. Obviously there are gender stereotypes, obviously there are areal differences, obviously there are so many of these particular variables that play a part in. But typically if you say that Eastern or Oriental populations, as I just mentioned, are technically deemed to be a bit more emotional. They have their own different ways of expressing emotion. They are collective in the way they express emotions, and emotions are not really seen as a sign of weakness. So nobody is typically embarrassed or shy of expressing their emotions. However, on the other hand, if you talk about the Western culture, if you talk about countries like the United States, the UK, Canada, Europe, and so on, the emotions are expressed in a very different way. It is not that people are not emotional, but their manner of expressing their emotions is relatively different to ours. Their manner of identifying emotions, putting a label on each emotion, or even being aware of what kind of emotion they are expressing is relatively different from us. And these are the and these differences not only exist on this broad axis that I've drawn in terms of Western and Eastern cultures, but there could be differences between different countries as well, within different countries and different regions as well. Say, for example, people could point out that maybe the way in which let's say Punjabis express their emotions, or in which Malayalis express their emotion, or some of our northeastern brothers and sisters express emotions, would have differences within each other. So there are obviously cultural annotations, there are cultural underpinnings underlying how people label their emotion, express their emotions, and even in some sense express their emotions. Accordingly, the languages that are spoken by these cultures can also sort of have an influence on how people are, talking about their emotions, labeling them, putting a tag to them, and also expressing these emotions, cross-culturally and cross-linguistically. For example, Kitayama and colleagues, in the kind of example I was talking about, Kitayama and colleagues actually found that Japanese participants were much more likely to describe their emotions using socially engaging terms such as friendly feeling and guilt and so on. And on the other hand, participants from the United States describe their emotions using socially disengaging emotion words such as anger or pride. You could see very well that the focus on how do you want to project yourself emotionally is also different in these two cultures. Say for example, typically in Kitayama's older work also you can see that he highlights Western cultures as more individualistic and Eastern cultures as more collectivistic, and in that sense many differences in cognitive styles and the way people express themselves can be understood. Now, interestingly, some researchers have coined the term indigenous emotions, to refer to the emotions which are not really found in the Western culture. For example, Skolin and colleagues did this in 2004, and there could be many examples. You could take examples from Urdu, you could take examples from Hindi, Malayalam, Tamil, Sanskrit, and so on. But for example, one of the examples that has been used in Bhatia and Ritchie's book that I'm referring for this chapter basically mentions the Japanese notion of amai. Now, amai basically refers to the ability to depend and presume upon others' love and basically bask in others' indulgence. Now, it is something that you could actually associate with the Japanese culture and how people are sort of brought up and how people can depend upon each other, can count upon each other in order to rear them emotionally, in order to understand and empathize them, wherein this sort of an emotion, where this sort of a feeling of amai actually makes sense. And since this cultural equivalent is not really found in the Western culture, it is also consequently very difficult to find a linguistic equivalent or a translational equivalent for the word amai in Western culture. Say for example, the closest English translations for amai are actually things like whining, sulking and pouting. And I'm sure that Japanese speakers would not really agree to the fact that, oh, I don't think that this is a faithful translation of the word amai in English, or the word translational equivalents in English are actually not expressing the word as we would want, in the way we would want it to express. Incidentally, since this it is therefore, you can say that it's very difficult for speakers in the Western culture, say for example native English speakers, to actually understand even this concept very well, and for Japanese people to express this concept in English. Again, we are not really making strong assumptions about that people are not able to experience emotions in different cultures because of culture or linguistic differences, because there has been a lot of work on emotions, and you can talk about Plutchik's basic emotions and so on, where there is obviously a certain degree of universality. But what we are trying to do here is we are trying to look at and nitpick at smaller differences. We are trying to nitpick at subtle differences between how emotions are categorized, labeled, and expressed or experienced across different linguistic groups or different cultural groups. Now, also, it has been pointed out that the context in which people learn a second or a third language can also play a very important role in which, in a way, they are able to represent their emotions in that language. For instance, a native language is typically, when you are growing up and you're first picking up language, the native language is actually used to encode one's childhood experiences, your first feelings of happiness or sadness or shame or disgust or being elated. And basically what we do is we use our first language to actually label these experiences, and then we keep recalling them back to sort of encode any similar experiences that we may have. And these words, these emotional words, actually provide a context for our future thoughts and feelings, and this is basically the initial learning that we are doing. Now, interestingly, the context in which we are picking up a second language, let's say we are picking up a second language in a very formal setting, let's say in a setting that is emotionally neutral, in a language class, or in a through an instructor who's sort of doing it in a very cold manner. Now, as a result, what would happen is that these individuals would never get the opportunity to code the emotional experiences in this second language. And because they've never gotten the opportunity to encode their emotional experiences in this second language, they would never be very good at expressing themselves or experiencing emotional words that are said in the second language. And this is precisely what sort of happens when bilinguals have actually been reported to often show a bias towards answering questions in their native language when they are actually discussing emotional topics. This is what I was just telling you moments ago. Also, it's interesting that research suggests that bilinguals actually tend to show more affect when they are speaking in their native language. When you are planning to express your affection towards someone, let's say a very good friend or your partner, or you're talking about a very emotional and a touchy topic, you typically try and resort to the language that you can best do it in. And for probably a majority of people, that is their first language, or that is their native language. Finally, in the same vein that individuals typically say, a very good example that's been taken by this book is the experience of swear words or taboo words. For example, a lot of individuals actually express that they experience the intensity of the swear words or the taboo words much more in their first language than in their second language, because those mappings between emotional experiences and the languages and words of the first language are much more stronger than the mapping of experiences of hurt or shame or disgust with words in their second language. Sometimes, and you would probably be able to share this feeling, that if somebody is talking to you badly, even for example in your second or third language, if you're not very good at the second or third language, you might not even be able to appreciate the gravity of what the person has said. And because you're not able to appreciate the gravity of what the person has said, you're not going to be as hurt, or not going to be appreciating the insult that is contained in those words. And this is very interesting, because a bunch of experiments have actually been done in this regard, and it has actually been confirmed. Interestingly, research has also shown that taboo words are associated with greater anxiety when they are expressed in one's first language rather than when they are expressed in a second or a third language. Now, in line with this fact that the context of acquisition of the second language really plays a role in one's expression of emotion, Harris in 2004 actually reported that childhood reprimands, when represented in an individual's native language, elicited much stronger emotional reactions than when they were presented in the first language. Say, for example, in an experiment, I am trying to remind you of some typical scoldings that we get in our house through our parents, mothers, fathers, grandparents, etc., etc. And when these reprimands are represented to you again, first time in your first language, second time in a second language, because they were, there is a certain degree of encoding specificity, because there is a certain degree of when did you hear them first, in what language, what impact it had on you when you first heard it, all of that comes back. And therefore they would elicit much stronger emotional reaction than when they are actually presented merely in the second or a third language. And interestingly, when this experiment was run, no difference, for early bilinguals, no difference was found in reaction to these childhood reprimands between the two languages. Because when you're learning both the languages at a very early age, typically the mapping of emotional experiences can happen with the words of both the languages. So typically what happens is that early bilinguals who get exposed to a second language or a third language at a very early age, let's say 1.5 years, 2 years, or since birth, they would actually have the opportunity of mapping their early emotional experiences with the words of both the languages, and hence they would not have this asymmetry of emotional experience in their two languages. For them, there would be no asymmetry, and they would be able to feel emotion, express emotion in both the languages equally. So the taboo words will be equally hurtful in both, let's say for me, English and Hindi, as opposed to for someone who has just learned English only after their 20s or after their 30s. And this is something, rather interesting, which tells us that there is a very, strong and interesting interplay of emotional experiencing and emotional expression that is going on between the languages of a bilingual or a multilingual. Also, something that has been very interestingly pointed out is that the properties of a specific language can actually be an important factor in how an individual's emotions are represented. I was talking to you about poetry. I was talking to you about how poetry is almost non-translatable, because when you are expressing yourself in a poem, let's say in Urdu or in Hindi or in English, you are actually using the linguistic structures of that specific language to express the deepest feelings of your heart. And it is the properties of that specific language that is helping you encode your deepest feelings in a very particular, unique manner that maybe is not allowed, or maybe will be differently allowed in the second or a third language. So in this regard, Gutfron actually reported that participants responded with greater affect, greater emotional experience in Spanish, even in cases when Spanish was the individual's second language. So basically the case that they're trying to make is because Spanish allows for a much more smoother experience or expression of emotion, people who are second language learners of Spanish actually could express their emotions better in Spanish. And again, remember, Spanish is deemed as one of the more romantic languages of the world, much like French and obviously a bunch of our Indian languages. Now, it has been suggested that perhaps the specific nature of a language can actually impact the way emotions are represented in individuals or speakers of this language. For example, that is one of the reasons why Spanish-speaking individuals, the therapeutic process, and if you're linking this with mental health, and today there is a lot of brouhaha about mental health, a lot of people have suffered significant mental health issues and mental health problems post-COVID, and there are a lot of people who are out there who want to provide help to these people, who want to provide therapy to these people. What the insights for people like those would be that the kind of language that you're using in therapy may actually be very instrumental in this whole therapeutic process. I mean, one of the researches that I'm just citing is that for Spanish-speaking individuals, the therapeutic process may actually be much more productive and meaningful when it is done in Spanish, since these individuals also prefer to express themselves in Spanish. Another very interesting aspect, or finding that has been actually reported was that individuals who were proficient in their second language, Spanish and let's say English, were actually, they responded equally well to emotions in both the languages. So again, as I'm saying, if you are very well proficient in both the languages, let's say if you are early or simultaneous bilingual, it might not really matter whether the emotional content is being expressed in either language. But typically when you are, let's say, a sequential bilingual, you have acquired your second language much later than after you have acquired your first language, it may create that asymmetry in both expression and experience of emotion that I'm talking about. It seems therefore that it is possible for bilinguals or individuals to acquire emotional representation in second language, provided that they are learning the two languages very early in age, provided they are very highly proficient in both the languages. Because indeed, some individuals are found perfectly capable of representing emotions in their second language along with their first. Say, for example, I know people who are very good in writing poetry or songs in both their languages. I had a friend who could write poetry in Malayalam and English as well at the same time, sing in Malayalam and English as well at the same time, and could express himself emotionally and otherwise in both the languages equally well. So if you have acquired the two languages very early in age, if you are very highly proficient in both the languages, there is no reason why your emotional expression would be handicapped in a second language. It could be at par with your first language as far as if your proficiency in both the languages is very high. And in this regard, Diwala actually reported that individuals who learned a second language in a natural setting actually gave higher ratings for the emotional force of swear or taboo words in the second language as compared to those who learned the second language in a classroom setting. So again, we were talking about context of acquisition very recently, and you can see here from this study that the context in which you have picked up the language, if it is a very emotionally neutral context, if it is a very cold and non-interactive sort of context, then obviously these handicaps will built in. But if you are being allowed to learn a second language in a communicative, in an interactive, in a natural setting by talking to your friends and peers, then you will probably acquire the language in a much more natural way, and therefore you will have acquired the ability to express and experience emotion even in your second or a third language. So the result from Diwala's studies actually implies that second language learning can also perhaps acquire a deeper emotional representation in a naturalistic learning setting than in a classroom. Obviously, further research could actually help to strengthen, the second language acquisition programs and tailor them to be more consistent with ecological experience, and that basically would help individuals to experience and express their emotions in a second or a third language equally well as they are doing it in the first language. That is all that I wanted to talk to you about in this week. We have talked about various aspects of how bilingualism and multilingualism affect our different manners of cognition, and in the next week I'm going to move on to more different, slightly miscellaneous topics about how bilingualism really has an impact on different things in our life. Thank you so much.